I'm a whole lot more bullish on the Eagles. 10.5 is juiced to the over for a reason. They've got a top 10 easiest, softest schedule, especially when you look at the start of it. They wrap up with 3 division games, but look at what's in their division. And that's not necessarily a tough spot. The tough spots on the schedule, I think, for Philly are maybe right out of the gate, having to start in Brazil against the Packers and then hosting the Falcons on a Monday night in week 2. There's a tough spot week 12, week 13, where they go to the Rams on a Sunday night, then go to Baltimore Thanksgiving weekend, not on Thanksgiving, but Thanksgiving weekend, I believe it is. So, there are a couple of tough spots there on the schedule, but they don't have 3 games in a row anywhere on their schedule where you go, ooh. In fact, if you look at it, they are a dog by more than a field goal in just 1 spot all year right now. They're favored by more than a field goal in 6 spots. This schedule stacks up nicely for them. I think it gives them an opportunity to work through new systems on both sides of the ball. Like you mentioned to Dave Zangaro a moment ago, that can be a bump in the road. But I think once you get past the Packers in week 1 and maybe Atlanta week 2, well, you've got New Orleans, you've got Tampa, you've got a bye week, you got the Browns, you got the Giants before you get to anyone really difficult, I think. Another fellow maybe conference championship contender, but from the AFC side in Cincy in week 8.
Going into the offseason, I thought that I would be fading the Philadelphia Eagles coming up. I really did. It just, from a betting perspective, when you look at them, and okay, their point differential was +5 and they were 11-6. That is signal for fade, right?
Mm-hmm.
When people were saying throughout much of last year, first 11, 12 weeks, oh my God, the Philadelphia Eagles are so fraudulent. They were 100% correct. Let's not forget that they were 10-1. They were 10-1, and then they lost 5 of 6 games. Why? Because they couldn't stop a nosebleed. And they were 10-1, going 7-1 in 1-score games. So a couple of those were overtime wins. Like, it was just it was just obvious to everyone. And then at the end of the year, you go 11-6 with that +5, and you're like, well, that was still lucky. And for the entire season, they were 8-3 in 1-score games. That was very lucky. And then you lose Jason Kelce to retirement. Oh man, what if all of these rushing, what if the whole tush push, brotherly shove, whatever thing you want to call it, what if that was all about Kelce, or much of it was about him? And then it changes once you bring in someone else. You have Jurgens as your center now moving forward. What if you lose that? Like, the difference that you had in Jalen Hurts, 15 rushing touchdowns. What if that's not a big threat anymore without Kelce and with a different offensive coordinator? Let's not forget that. So I wanted to fade this team because I thought so much of it was luck. They can't stop anybody. Secondary is pathetic. And man, you make a move when you get Vic Fangio. That brings stability to the organization. Yeah. That brings stability to that side of the ball. Is it going to happen immediately? I'm not sure. But I would expect them to play well in the second half of the season. And we talked about it with our insider Dave, and we're like, look, all of the attention is going to Saquon, but I'm interested in the defense. And they completely revamped the secondary. And you bring in C.J. Gardner-Johnson, you take your first-round pick, you take your second-round pick. What do we need to do? We need to add to the secondary. And that's exactly what they did. But they're also not in a position where they need huge contributions. Gotta be, starter quality with the first and second round picks because of the other moves that they made. And by the way, Isaiah Rodgers flies under the radar. That guy was suspended for gambling last year. And if you buy into PFF, they think he's one of the best cover corners in the league. Now you're adding him to the secondary as well. It wasn't, okay, let's put a Band-Aid on this thing. Let's make 1 or 2 moves, add a free agent, add a draft pick. No, multiple draft picks. Okay, got a guy coming back from suspension. Now let's go spend in free agency too. Like, they are attacking it. They truly believe that was the biggest reason for their free fall last season. And I would agree with that. And the defensive end, when you look at every level, there is some top end talent at every level of this defense. So I'm buying into the idea of a big turnaround, even though it is a new coach. Now, Sean Desai was a mess. and that's why you make Patricia the guy. But how much of it is changing? Because Vic Fangio used to coach with Sean Desai. So
Mm-hmm.
they were here in Chicago at the same time. So I just imagine that Desai used a lot of the concepts and way of thinking that Vic Fangio does.
Hurts 16-1 MVP, Barkley 14-1 Offensive Player of the Year. I don't think I'm betting a running back other than McCaffrey Offensive Player of the Year, especially given that Saquon hasn't necessarily been the best receiver out of the backfield. So I'll ignore that number. Hurts at 16-1 for MVP is interesting. I don't know. This is where it all starts, and I wouldn't say ends, because Brown and Smith are an important part of this. Goddard as well on the offensive side, and the remade offensive line, like you talked about with Kelsey retiring. But Hurts and Barkley and who gets more on the ground is the most interesting dynamic to me in this offense.
Yeah, as far as offensive player of the year, it's just going to be divvied up so much between the receivers, and don't forget
Mm-hmm.
Goddard is a good chunk of that
Yeah,
offense as well. And yeah, they're not downgrading. I view it as an upgrade, and I'm not, the guy that wants to throw a ton of money, ton of assets at the running back position. But there's no doubt about it that Saquon is more dynamic than Swift. So I expect to see a little bit of that, and that's going to help them a ton. If we are both so high on Philadelphia, and we both are, like you quickly
yeah.
just mentioned it a moment ago, there's value on Jalen Hurts for MVP if we
Mm-hmm.
believe that. If you're going to be that high, if they're going to get double digits in wins, if they're going to win the NFC East, if they're going to be, let's call it a top 2 seed in the NFC, that means there's value on Jalen Hurts at 16-1. He is now the
Absolutely.
7th favorite. He's about the same price as Brock Purdy. You tell me. The Niners and Eagles are
Ooh,
both having great seasons. Which one's more likely to win the MVP, Brock Purdy or Jalen Hurts? It's not that hard.
Hurts. Yeah.
Yeah. I think
I
that's an
mean,
interesting look. I might be placing a wager on him for MVP this year. But obviously, all of this correlates. When you're picking
so
MVP, you're high on that team to do a bunch of big things.
and that's what I was going to say. I find myself when I look at the MVP board, the numbers I like are, even though it's a good bit shorter, Burrow at 9 or 10-1, right? Hurts because I like the Bengals and the Eagles. So I find myself, this is where you start to have to find the lane of what bet do I like the most on this team given the prices that are out there, right? So for me, I can see the Eagles winning the East and even making a run in the playoffs without Hurts being MVP caliber, right? Like, he'll be in the conversation, but I don't think he does enough to win it. I think Barkley's going to be looked at as a
Mm.
big impact on the offense for them, and so maybe that siphons away some of the some of the some of those that will look at Hurts and say, well, he's the reason the Eagles are winning. They'll look at Saquon and say, well, they brought Barkley in because they couldn't allow Hurts to do it all anymore. So that's where I start to lean in more on, like I said, an alternate win total or maybe even an NFC conference championship number rather than Hurts. But it is the price at 16-1 is really good if you believe in the Eagles and Hurts to do a lot of damage this year.